All right. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me okay? Yes, good. We're leaving the lights on while I project the slides because they're doing a video, and this will probably wind up in one of those music channels. You know, probably get an Emmy for this. No. But I hope that that doesn't, you know, take away the light from the images. You'll let me know. This talk is entitled "Dwelling on Its Tropes: The Cuban Visual Imagination in Exile." I've used the concept of tropes in practically all the criticism I've published over the last 37 years, frightening number. Because I've seen it as a way of understanding how Latin American art in general in the 20th century and since have used, Latin American artists have used these devices to develop their interest in expanding the powers of representation. One of the things that distinguishes modernism when it emerges in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century, and eventually when it spreads, of course, throughout the rest of the world, and here in the United States especially also, there was a keen interest in bracketing, in putting aside the power of representation in art. Artists were seeking a kind of purity, a kind of immediacy, that only the medium as the message and as the absolute presence could afford. Latin American artists took a somewhat different approach to the issue of representation. They never totally relinquished it. They incorporated various modernist styles, but they brought them in and sometimes mixed them together in very strange ways. Interesting ways, in their desire to expand the power of representation in painting in particular. And that's why tropes became so important. Now, what are tropes? Tropes are figures, constructs, that really stand outside of language. They are, we use them all the time. We use hyperbole, exaggerations, we use metaphor, we use others that are probably less familiar that we'll talk about today, metonymy and synecdoche, for instance. They are constructs that enable us to say something other than what language means. And tropes are always distinguished by a break between what is being said in language. Okay, I'm speaking here. What it says is different than what it means. So if I say, your eyes are diamonds, only a pedant would think that they are literally diamonds. In fact, many times we make jokes out of just, I'm tied up at the office, I'm not literally tied up. So we use these in familiar speech all the time, and we understand that they mean something else. So that in itself already initiates a process by which an utterance or an image can mean something outside of what it's actually saying. And in fact, usually what it says is understood immediately as nonsensical. So it brackets, it puts into brackets, it puts to the side various concepts and allows other meanings to be entertained and to be understood immediately. Tropes also have the ability to establish a different kind of syntax. Like when you're reading a poem, all the words in the poem are interconnected, even beyond just the syntax, beyond the actual sentences in which they appear. If at the beginning of the poem there is a rose, in the second line there is a freight train, 2 lines down there is a volcano, and somewhere else there's a giraffe, those things are connected in the poem in the way you intended beyond the actual sentences. The fact that they're in that poem, they're like molecules ricocheting and affecting each other. That's part of the power of tropes. So the painters, in particular, became very interested they weren't interested in tropes. They were interested in ways of expanding representation. And the model that I've generated is to try to understand how these tropes operate given their desire to expand the powers of representation. And before we get more into it, why did they want to expand the powers of representation? What was it about the Latin American imagination in the 1920s, which is really when modernism starts to really flourish throughout the hemisphere, in Mexico, in Havana, in Buenos Aires, in Rio, and other places, but those in particular. What is it about the Latin American imagination that did not surrender to the otherwise very common, popular, and official sort of interest in abstraction and in other modes that would emphasize the power of the medium, of the actual presence of the painting, and not what it was alluding to or referring to? I think part of it has to do with the fact that Latin America was not part of the First World War trauma. World War I shook radically to its foundations the European imagination, and it also affected North America and many other parts of the world. But Latin America basically was not directly impacted by this. So the initial sort of aversion to all the previous modes of discourse, of cultural discourse, which was already sort of in the works, but really became overwhelming as a result of the trauma of World War I, didn't hit the region except through secondary references. On the contrary, it was in the 1920s when Latin America was interested in pushing its own visual styles, its own codes, its own images. So while the modernists in Europe were trying to come up with new ways or new images, and really were rejecting many of the iconic images of their own civilization because of the war and other reasons, the Latin Americans, and in this case Cubans as well, were interested in the exact opposite. They wanted to use modernist styles to paint palm trees and mameyes and carnivals. They wanted to update their national idiom because they were very interested in a sort of artistic nationalism. They were the Cuban vanguardia and the vanguardia throughout, tropicalismo in Brazil and all these other tendencies everywhere else, were very interested in the American idiom, American in the sense of the hemisphere. And they wanted to bring in the pre-Columbian, the African legacies, the Spanish colonial legacy, anything that resonated with regional identity, but to do it in modernist styles, which in Europe were being used to get away from cultural references. So representation obviously was very important to these artists. They weren't interested in just, purity. They wanted somebody to look at that and say, that's Argentinian, that's Peruvian, that's Cuban. They wanted to update their national idiom. So representation was extremely important. So obviously, here, these artists were really like breaking the rules, which is one of the reasons why Latin American art of the 20th century was never well received in the United States or in Western Europe, because they were doing these bizarre things. You're doing cubism, but you're not trying to move toward abstraction. You've got a pineapple in the middle of this thing. That's bizarre. Why do you have a pineapple? You should be interested in the geometry. No, I want the pineapple there. This is what it's about. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason is that these artists were also, some of them were going to Europe and staying or visiting and coming back to their respective countries. And others were just getting information by whatever, books, magazines, whatever trickle came through. There was no internet, and stuff like that. So sometimes the styles, the information about these new styles in Europe was coming out of order, was coming out of sync. So, you know, suddenly in one area, let's say some artist from Lima would go to Paris at the height of synthetic cubism and then bring it to Peru, and then someone else from Lima would go maybe 5, 6 years later when something else was happening, surrealism, let's say, or whatever, and then they would bring that, and so suddenly you would have cubism and surrealism in one image, because these were the influences that people were hearing, and they were mixing them up. They weren't interested in the stylistic sequence, oh, the cubists, and then come the constructivists, and then come those who rebel against them, and then this. And no, for them it was like, you know, mixing pastelito de guayaba with you know, a steak, you know, whatever. Just throw it all together and pa'lante, right? And so that's one of the, that sort of chronological heresy was one of the things that totally throws North American and Western European curators who were like, you know, were very interested in this sort of stylistic hygiene, you know, keeping everything sort of separate. Torres Garcia of Uruguay, for instance, who had worked in Europe and then comes back to the Americas. He had spent a great deal of time, grew up in Barcelona, and then there was living in Paris. He was very much of a European. And when he returns to Montevideo, he combines the constructivist grid with pre-Columbian looking pictographs. It was very influenced by what he's seen in Peru, and so suddenly these things don't look very constructivist and very, you know, Bauhaus, or very, you know, they kind of look a little fuzzy and a little irregular, and then there's a bunch of letters and numbers, and so when that gets picked up in the urban, it's crazy. You have a constructivist, and then he's on top of that, he's filling it up with a bunch of letters and numbers and symbols. Well, yes, welcome to Latin America. So that was part of the enchantment. So how do you reconcile, how do you balance all of these different stylistic indicators and these different cultural agendas? You do it through tropes. You do it through tropes. Let's see. All right. So, oh, by the way, wait. I have an image here of Julio Larraz, who is one of our contemporary wonderful artists. It's called The House of the Tragic Poet. Dwellings are going to be a very important part of the Cuban pictorial imagination, by the way. You're going to see different references to buildings, windows, for some reason we became, in particular Cuban art, became very interested in images of architecture. And I think maybe that has to do with perhaps the legacy of architecture in Cuba, but of course you have that also in Mexico and in Peru and Argentina and everywhere else. So I don't really have an explanation. Maybe the desire for to understand the shelter as a kind of protection that stands in and of itself has something to do with the island mentality. That I leave to, you know, more psychologically oriented critics, but we do have a lot of that presence. And here we have the you know, sort of like the Exile, the House of Exile. That could be Miami there at the end of Florida, except Florida isn't that tall.
Dim the lights a little bit because.
Yeah, can we dim the lights? They're having trouble seeing it. Is everybody having trouble seeing it?
Yes.
Yeah? No?
You lose a lot.
Yeah, you lose a lot, and it's. I'm not that important. You can just sort of Photoshop me out of this, and let's see if we can. All right, so Amelia Peláez was one of the founding modernists of the Cuban imagination. Perhaps the most influential of these first-generation figures that emerges in the late 20s and then later in the 30s, of course, and on, is a good example of how this tropological imagination operates. Amelia had been in Paris. She had been very much influenced by sort of like late Cubist, synthetic Cubism. She was there already at a time in which the Surrealists were kicking in, but apparently she was moving more in other circles, and the influence of, you know, the Picasso, the Three Musicians, or Alexandra Exter were stronger. whatever, when she returns to Cuba is really when she starts putting all of these influences together. But she's also interested, again, in something very Cuban. And what could be more Cuban than the stained glass windows of colonial architecture in Havana? And so here we have an excellent example of metaphor. A metaphor is a trope that unites two reference in a single image. And what it does is it conspires against our sense of time, because you're seeing two things at once. Generally, we see, you know, all sorts of things and we put it together and we have a sense of the room, let's say. But with a metaphor, you're literally seeing these two reference simultaneously, or you're intending them in your mind if someone is using a metaphor, let's say in a poem or in everyday speech. So here the painting becomes the vitral, or the stained glass window, and the stained glass window becomes the painting. And you have this complete fusion of these two things. What you have, however, is that in order to understand these two things simultaneously, you have a single image. The image really just takes over the entire painting. There's no story. This isn't a story about somebody's window and somebody looking out of it, and no. It's just the image presented in this radical juxtaposition. Another of the important tropes is metonymy. Now again, metonymy is fancy, you know, Greek term for something we use all the time. It's what conditions our sense of language, and it's what conditions the way we can obtain meaning from language, or even from the room that we're in. We're in this room and we expect chairs and paintings and microphones and a screen and so forth. We would be rather surprised to walk into this room and see, I don't know, a fire engine or a giraffe or in the middle of the room, right? Because that would sort of disrupt our sense of the continuity of what we expect in this room. If, on the other hand, we were at Metro Zoo, we would expect to see a giraffe and not a podium with a microphone and a screen, right? That would be equally incongruous there. So metonymy is what establishes transference of meanings. Things that are in proximity to each other transfer their meanings to each other, and it's the basis on which we create a context. So let's say if somebody paints a portrait of you, and surrounding the image of you in the portrait, there are let's say weapons, or, you know, daggers and knives and guns. You would say, oh my goodness, you're making me look like a warrior, or you know, a violent person, or at least somebody who's interested in war or something like that. And I'm not. Why? Because these things are surrounding you in the image, and therefore the meanings of these things are being transferred to you. Now, in somewhat more sophisticated and more complex imagery, metonymy also, however, is a wonderful trope because it enables you to establish a sense of temporality, of action. So if the metaphor is a freeze frame of a juxtaposition, a metonymy is really what enables the painting to assume a theatrical quality, a narrative quality. In Carlos Enrique's Rapto de las Mulatas, the rape or the abduction of the mulatas from 1938, what you have are these transparencies, as in so much of his work. Things start to dissolve. You see the figures through the horses, and the horses all wrapped up in the figures and the landscape, and it all becomes almost a kaleidoscopic swirl of things that are occurring. And something is happening, and there's a narrative that is implied. And there's a sense of action, perhaps caught at this moment, but it isn't just frozen in that moment. You're assuming something happened before, and something's going to happen afterward. So the theatrical impulse that was so important to the Latin American imagination finds in metonymy its own particular and important trope. And then there is synecdoche, another fancy Greek term for a rather simple concept. A synecdoche is a trope that establishes the presence of the infinite in a recurring pattern in one particular image. So again, let's take a familiar image, the banister here, or the stairs outside. Any stairs, any two steps is already a code for an infinite series of steps. Right? You could conceptually extend them. The chairs that are lined up, they establish a pattern, and just say with just two chairs, and it could go on for 8 chairs, or 25 chairs, or 17,000 chairs. So synecdoche is something, again, that we are quite familiar with. Any kind of pattern that involves the implication of infinite repetition is synecdochic. And so here we have in Mijares' Geométrico of 1952 an interesting example of that. So whereas you have a figure, sorry about that. So you have a central figure, a woman surrounded by these vitrales, but now they've been turned into very geometric shapes. There's all sorts of recurring patterns that establish a synecdochic play on everything that's going on. This could conceivably, these patterns could continue in every direction from the painting. And the presence of the infinite is extremely important in the Latin American modernist adventure, by the way, and as is metonymy. Neither is that strong in North American art, and when it is, it's in individual artists who often are thought of as kind of strange and out of the regular sort of explanation for what's going on in different styles. And so, why is that? I think in part that has to do with the presence of a certain expectation of visual images. Latin America, after all, comes from, is steeped in not just Catholic liturgical imagery, but also the various pre-Columbian and indigenous cultures that have continued to influence many parts of Latin America are also very much interested in the connection, in this case, between the infinite pattern and narrative, symbolic narration of some kind. You think of West African cultural survivals as well. Any culture that is steeped in liturgy and that is interested in the magical animistic powers of objects and what have you is going to be interested in metonymy. What more vivid example of metonymy can you imagine than the inhabiting of an object through magic, right? Whether, let's say, it's an amulet or any object that is used in Santeria or in any of these religions, that this object is literally inhabited by a presence, by a deity, by a force. That's like metonymy, you know, several times over. All right, so I'm putting these three images here because what happens is, and what we're going to look at is how these different tropes come together and start combining themselves in a very dynamic tropological imagination. So, whereas I have here Amelia as our example of metaphor, clearly she's also involved in synecdoche with all these different patterns and their repetitions. Whereas you have our friend Carlos Enriquez here embodying this concept of theater and action and metonymy. Also, of course, the horse and the men and sexual violence and the whole bit is all connected. So there's all sorts of other links, metaphorical and otherwise. And obviously here too we don't just have patterns, we have representations. The patterns turn into an interior, a woman in a room, flower, whatever things that are in that room, which brings us into other references, not just simply synecdoche. The third generation artists, which emerge really in the late 40s and 50s in particular, break somewhat from the heavy impact of metonymy, especially in the Cuban imagination, in the 40s, in the 30s and 40s. I guess in part it's because metonymy is a storyteller's trope, and the artists wanted to tell stories. And also the huge influence of Mexican muralism. Can you think of anything more metonymic than a Diego Rivera mural with layer upon layer of Mexican history interacting, this huge soup of history bouncing off of each other? Metonymy, on steroids. And that had a huge impact on the Cuban artists of the 40s, on the 30s. But after that, when you have the emergence of the subsequent Cuban artists, you have in the third generation, which is really the generation of complete maturity, because by now the concepts have now settled in. The international styles are coming in much more reliably, not just in drips and drabs. And the artists are traveling. They're going to New York, and they're going to France, and they're going here, and they're going there. And artists are coming into Cuba as well. So things start taking a different kind of shape. It's no longer, you know, something as haphazard, perhaps, as it was before. And so here we have artists like Agustin Fernandez that gives us an excellent example of the primacy of metaphor in this generation, where the skin, the torso, the breasts fuse with this sort of like armor-like image. The allusions to Artemis, the Artemis figures from deep antiquity, those Greek goddesses that were fertility goddesses with all the breasts. And also this idea that the image is, again, very, very much a fusion of two things, armor and flesh. In the case of Hugo Consuegra, this rather interesting abstract image is almost becomes a sculpture in monotones, captured within something that looks kind of like a room. This could be a window, maybe facing out, but there's this internal storm. There's this element that is caught inside of an architectural element, if you will, insinuated. All these things mean that the tropes are getting more complex. Emilio Sanchez, for instance, here we have a good example of synecdoche, right? The patterns repeating themselves. But we also have very much of a building. It isn't just patterns. This is a series of windows in a building. It's a snapshot. It's a synecdochic isolation of a pattern. But we also have, of course, a dwelling. We have, again, this intense Cuban interest in dwellings. And we have an internal infinite that is implied through these doors, where we can just keep losing ourselves into the dimensions within the room of this house, as well as the different patterns that repeat on the lines and on the persianas, on the shutters, and so forth. And in the case of Rolando Lopez de Irube's Altered Sphere, here we have a good example of an artist who was very deeply influenced by the geometric styles, which became very important in Cuba in the 1950s. And this is from the 1970s. His Altered Sphere also coalesces the exuberance of these tropical woods. I don't recall. I think this was probably Dominican mahogany. And the sphere has like a concave section that has been carved out, and it gets filled in, if you will, or colonized or inhabited by these copper tubes that perpetuate the idea of the sphere, but in a much looser manner. And this is a sort of image or metaphor, if you will, of the way the grains themselves also emerge on the sphere. So here we have this geometric object, but really it's filled with all these other resonances. And you can see how these different tropes are all interconnecting at this point. And with this, we advance. I'm making a huge leap. Lots of artists get left out. Sorry, you know, interrogate me later. But there's only so many images we can go through. So now I'm going to be looking at artists who are, you know, probably at the peak of their career at the moment. And here we have Roaldo Rodriguez, a very interesting painting called Aquarium, also titled Thetis. It's been through 2 titles, and so now we're using both. Thetis, of course, is the sea nymph who was the mother of Achilles in the Iliad. I must have said that wrong. You always set off alarms at universities when you mispronounce Greek stuff. All right, so Thetis, yeah. So Thetis, here we have this image of this woman next to an aquarium. And she is pondering these creatures, these fish, and this life inside of this shelter, which is an aquarium. All right, but she's standing outside of it. We are seeing her, though, through different layers. We're seeing there's the glass that we're the viewers faced with, which we don't see, but it's obvious, it's intuitive. Then we have the glass that separates her from the aquarium, and then we have the space behind her. So we have, in effect, different layers of space that are implied in this theatrical scenario And at the same time, the fish, the refractions, the patterns, the ripples on the water introduce a synecdochic element, fusing these two tropes rather successfully in this very sudden theatrical moment of this painting. Ismael Gómez Peralta, from his series Asedio, gives us a similar kind of implied layering. Imagine you're driving in Malecón in Havana, and you're looking at the city through a glass. Maybe you're not driving. Maybe you're in another building on the Malecón looking at this building. Or you're in a car and you're being taken somewhere, God knows where. There's an implied layer upon which the painting is, all the actual paint and the gestures are occurring. And at the same time, there's this sense of movement, of the theater of the city, if you will, caught at this moment between an implied layer of action and that is at the same time translucent. It reminds us a little bit of the Carlos Enriquez painting as well. Jose Bedia in Conda is a very good example of metonymy, very much of a storytelling image. The man is seeking to escape from this female presence that is emerging from this water, perhaps a spiritual presence calling out to him, her voice. There's a shadow world, a very Jungian sort of shadow world in this painting. Her voice turns into his face, the shadow in his face. His shadow in turn turns into a deer, hunted, an animal that is preyed upon by predators. His leg is caught in the past. He is trying to cut away, Nangonda, cut away a path away from the situation. He sees himself in this branch that he holds, but the shadow of the branch is the woman. So there's this metonymic interaction between shadow and the figures that cast it, as well as the story that is being told throughout. And obviously the synecdochic element is especially strong in the way in which this pattern really dominates our view of the man in the painting. So what you see then is the maturation of a really complex tropological imagination in these artists, right? In Humberto Castro, Innocence and Betrayal. Oh, now I see why I wasn't so audible before. Innocence and Betrayal gives us another kind of implied storyline where we have these two figures that are walking perhaps through a dangerous area, a trap. One is leading the other one. This one has a knife. Who knows who is innocent and who is going to do the betraying? And as they're walking, there's this cube-like figure that's broken up into 6 different shapes as a three-dimensional projection, and they're walking through it. It's almost like a shelter that they have in their own reference and their own imaginations. There's something that is keeping them. Perhaps it's imprisoning them. Perhaps it's protecting them. But as this action is unfolding, you have these two figures that suddenly appear within this geometric shape that fulfills the presence of dwelling in this painting. In Gustavo Acosta, I have 2 paintings here. Can you see these? Badly. Because these are kind of dark. Well, this one down here is a street scene of Havana, and this one is looks like something under a bridge with water. This obviously is a very clear example of synecdoche, but because of its sort of architectural component, the image of dwelling also always is going to have a metonymic implication. Something can happen here. But here we have this wonderful pattern that conceptually continues infinitely toward us and envelops us. But you also have that here in the more realistic or more habitable vision of the street. The windows, the street can also be a kind of synecdochic pattern, not as geometric as this one, but certainly we can think of each of these metonymic scenarios of these interiors as being represented through a synecdoche of windows and buildings and doors leading off to the infinite. Time for some water. Paul Sierra is an artist who lives in Chicago. And some of these artists, by the way, came in the 90s, and others have lived here for a much longer period of time. They're all sort of roughly fifth-generation figures, people more or less my age, maybe a little younger, or maybe older, maybe 10 years older, and maybe a little younger than I am. So Paul Sierra gives us these wonderful landscapes, and here we have a sense of landscape as a theatrical setting. There's this figure, a man clothed as if he were going to the office, perhaps, and he's stepping into this space of darkness between the light under the trees. It's coming through the trees and creates a synecdochic pattern of light and dabs of paint, just creating a kind of infinite sequence here, and then reflecting on this, and then this light and darkness is very sort of Manichaean stage where the man is walking. Is he going to jump into the water? Is he simply walking through a wilderness? We don't know, but obviously something is happening, and the tropes are encapsulating and communicating in. Heriberto Mora's Leap of Faith is a very interesting image which actually captures all three of these tropes in one. As is common in his work, we have these dark interiors, these cavernous interiors, in which these sculptural images emerge. Here we have this anvil that emerges like a sculpture, but it's also a building, a dwelling. We can enter this. There's an interior. This is in an interior, and this is an interior that we are not privy to, but maybe they're one and the same. Shapes with interiors, obviously the bell as well. We have our friend the ladder here, which is a synecdochic symbol, as well as the road. And these, again, imply infinite patterns, but they're caught inside of these other infinites of interiors within interiors, sculptures, shelters within shelters, and so forth. Maria Brito, sculpture entitled After the Conquest, is a very interesting use of certain archetypal images. The chair, with its governed by its four legs and the rectangularity of its basic shapes, reminds us that it is very much a terrestrial icon, an image of the four cardinal points, a reflection of our own anatomy. We're all sitting in chairs, after all, except me. And so these are they echo your body. But this is a very peculiar chair. Attached to it are these angelic wings, and the chair itself is also resting on wooden clouds. From the back of the chair is a window and a phone cord, and pretty soon we're going to have to footnote that object, because phone cords are rapidly becoming the stuff of archaeology. Frightening. So this is a plastic phone cord for those of you who are young and don't know what they are. And it ends on a disc. On the disc is an ear painted. The ear, of course, also picks up metaphorically the wings, and it's also surrounded by clouds. So we have a wonderful intersection of terrestrial and angelic or celestial realities in a highly theatricalized sort of object that could in itself be a stage, a metonymic stage where these things are interacting and fusing and telling a story. Pero Icaino, from a series of black paintings, very much influenced by graffiti and trying to capture the spontaneity also of children's drawings and just very cathartic kind of imagery. But what's most interesting from our perspective is how this gun, this rifle, this thing is also a conflation of, you have a bus, you have a light bulb, you have a nose, you have a face, a shoe, a large shoe, a phone, and you have all these different things that are coming together, creating out of that metaphorical fusion of all these things a more or less recognizable silhouette of a machine gun. But the object itself becomes an imploded image where all these things come together, And yet somehow it also tells a story. The thing is in action. It's spewing out fire. The gestural quality of the brushwork also gives us a sense of velocity and movement and change. Metonymy and metaphor also at work in Aldo Menendez's collage, photographic and paint, photography and paint, in which you have these different images of from Havana, the ruins of Havana, and then these cloud elements that are pastiched onto or collaged onto the surface and painted. So you have in effect sort of like these elements, which are paintings within paintings, another recurring motif in Cuban in particular, but Latin American in general also, visual imagination, these internal worlds where you have these representations within representations within representations, and you have that here. But you also have, of course, ironically, an image of dilapidation and ruin that typifies Havana today. Ana Albertina Delgado also gives us this wonderful image where you have all three tropes also interacting. You have the patterns that are in the girl is like swirling, and her skirt is swirling out, and we catch her from the view from the top. These are her feet, and perhaps these are indicators of her steps as she has swirled about in this sort of imaginary space and created this pattern through her movements that is also picked up in this almost cellular image of her dress, dominated not just by her, but by this very bizarre insect. Rather, sort of like an oniric vision of the way in which all three of these tropes can come together. Angel Vapor gives us these wonderful sculptures. This one's a bronze casting of a tank, of an acetylene tank or some other kind of tank, and the propeller, of course, from a boat. And together they form all sorts of possibilities, flower, seed, but also a contraption to navigate, as the title tells us. An allusion to the bizarre machines that Cubans have to construct out of other machines, cannibalizing their elements in order to create functioning devices for their everyday lives, given the economic and political system that they live in. You can't get a plumber to save your life. So you have to create these different things. So you have, and the propeller becomes also rather important in other artists' work. You have another image here by Angel Vapor, in which you have a combination of this figure. This is called Birth of Hero, and this is the 12-foot bronze. This is the working model, which would hopefully eventually include this beautiful, whoops, this thing has died on me. No? Here it is. And so this will be on something like this, like in a large park, and people can walk through this and so forth. And there'll be water here and what have you. Of course, the firefighter figure has become a sort of important iconic image of bravery and duty, especially since 9/11. But here, what is interesting is that the figure is introspective. He's not charging off into a building to save people. He's standing in a sort of meditative pose. The helmet on his chest sort of evokes somewhat almost the female principle, the image of pregnancy perhaps. The axe that he's holding, of course, a classic image of the male principle. So you have both of these things coalesced in this one figure. And it also reminds us, alludes to, at least in some way, to the birth of Aphrodite. So Birth of Hero is the male version of the emergence of the Aphrodite of myth. And then we have a new myth here that we've collectively created, the firefighter. Julio Antonio gives us these wonderful images of these, also these blades, these cycling blades, and these teeth, that come in from the sides. So it's like you're peering into this, like, jagged reality. And in it you have, of course, all these synecdochic elements. You have stairs, you have patterns, you have things within things repeating themselves, the labyrinth of Cuba. You have an image of Fidel Castro here stretching his arms out to capture the island. You have tombs, you have tubes. It is a sort of swirling, dynamic world in which all of these scrambled figures are literally being sort of tossed like inside of a vortex. It's too bad, I don't think you can see that one very well. This is by Adriano Huergo. You have his fans, which also embody as this idea of the machine that has to be reconstituted with other parts in order for it to function. It rises sort of on this oil slick, which in the shape of more or less of Cuba. And synecdochically, you have these patterns collaged into the back of newsprint and other things that create this sort of endless pattern of the days that really don't change and of a time that really doesn't alter, sort of like an anti-metonymy being reinforced through a synecdochic pattern. I hope these words are starting to mean something at this point, and hopefully you'll be able to use them in parties and in conversations with your friends. And of course, no one will like you after that, but you'll lose all your friends. But think about it, you really didn't like them anyway. But so now you can just drop these words like, oh my God, how that is so metaphor. And then and people will be, oh my God, you're such a synecdochic, predictably synecdochic person. And they'll like, yeah. And you can text me, how that goes. Not well, I can assure you. Carlos Alfonso, from one of his two paintings called Memento Mori. And metonymic, because all of his work is metonymic. All these tongues and daggers and eyes are constantly like caught up in this vortex. This generation, obviously, because of many of them who went through the revolutionary process and were caught up in those vortexes. So you see a lot of these vortexes appearing. That's one of the reasons I think why metonymy also became much more important in this generation. It recovered its initial power in Cuban art, because in the presence of a nation that's really made up of stories, many of them lies and others exaggerations, the artists have to respond with their own kind of narratives. So the paintings have to become metonymic, much more so. Whereas when you had a more stable and aesthetically oriented period, let's say in the 50s, metaphor rises to prominence. Anyway, that's my interpretation of why metonymy has come back with such a vengeance. David Diaz, emerging artist who lives here in Florida. These are very strange constructions. They include, they have real rocks which are painted, and he has these different resins that create this pool, this swirling pool, of course, all gelled, and then these objects, these rocks, which kind of remind us of the rituals. Afro-Cuban rituals and others, and it's also a very interesting sort of flashback to the Amelia Peláez. You have a kind of window here. You don't have vitrales, but you do have these resins, and then you have these lines and these designs. So it's kind of like a bow to that. Alejandro Mendoza's sculpture, Enormous, is a good example of a metaphor using a synecdoche. The chain link fence becomes a kind of sail, the burnt beam a kind of ship. And so you can see how these two things interact rather simply and directly in that particular image. And Carlos Domenech, a photographer, this wonderful series of his of constructions, taken of buildings that were going up in Miami, especially in Coral Gables, and captured at this moment in which they're most mysterious. I find these photographs absolutely extraordinary. Here's metonymy. I mean, this thing looks like a stage from an ancient Roman ruin. And look at these barriers that almost become masks. And the lighting and everything about this, and of course synecdoche. Look at all the patterns that, of course, imply the construction that will continue. I tell you, you can use these words even in Publix. Try it. You won't get Baker acted or anything, I promise. Okay, I'm going to end with a few poems that, since after all I've used all these poetic terms to interpret art, I want to show you how it also kind of boomerangs back into my life as a poet. But of course I can't read them from here. So can you read it? No? I'll have to get closer here. This is a painting called The Intruder by Bruno Arras. And it's a monkey playing around with fruits and rearranging things the way artists usually do. He comes amid the light of apples, the window's dusk, and the marble curtains. Though slightly, he moves the faces fruit and cloth turn to the lace angles of morning. No new order results as he allows his shadow to fall like a peel among the elements of beauty. A simple beast, a monkey in a still life, and yet his acts are part of the scene's incantatory, ambiguous praise of bareness and frailty. Unlike a kiss or a comet, he vanishes imperfectly, like a fist blossoming, a city blurring in the guardian sands, or the hate of a woman. I was breaking up with somebody. I thought it would never break up. Now I can't even remember her name.
Oh my goodness.
It's the vitamins I take, they're not as effective. All right. Era Tropical, based on a painting by Mario Carreño. And what's interesting about this painting, talking about metonymy and theater, you have this window, again, dwelling, architectural situation. You have this landscape behind it. Now, she is standing outside the window in the natural world, which is kind of odd. You would expect her to be in front of the window, right? She's in a rather incongruous place. And sort of that incongruity is sort of what the sonnet is about. We know Carreño dreamt the faceless nude, one breast exposed, the other draped in hand. Though her poise beat Angre, she made her stand outside the window with all of nature at her back. Our view's been left inside, framed by sill, making the pages of the scene incongruous. She ought instead to be the master of the room, serene in shelter, and we, in eyes wrought wild, the honed men the forest could not hold, animated to take on the burden of multiplicity. Who wouldn't father, guardianship, and myriad duties to be watched and loved by a woman with no eyes? I haven't had a happy life, as you can see. I started a series of sonnets on, I teach English, and so I wanted to do a series of sonnets on, you know, nouns and gerunds and plurals and singulars and stuff, and I've only done a couple, and this is the only one I like. It's called Plural, and I also wanted like animal fables, and this is a painting by Biel Acosta called Kraken, and it didn't totally inspire the sonnet, but I thought it was just a wonderful projection of this, what the sonnet is about. The octopus appears to be a viper's nest. Forget the coded shades emotions taint, or the thoughtful eye that pries a problem loose, as when a sunken jar where praise at rest is unlid by the sleepy head that figures the use of 8 extremities when 4 would do. There is comfort to so soft a beast that signs its flight with ghosts of paint, whose flesh a crack of rock will veil in hue. Each arm will score the fold of its embrace, as if tide or fickleness controlled the crew, and there were no center, no law to tame these forces into provinces. A mane of coils makes art of dissidence. always bewildered how the octopus can get all that together, you know? I'm clumsy with just 2 arms, you know? That's why I stopped eating octopus, you know? And I thought, this thing's smarter than me, you know? Full respect. By the way, Adiela Costa is part of a group called Guild, a group of emerging artists who reside here in Miami. And you can look them up online at www.guild-artists.com. They're a very interesting group of emerging artists that are trying to have recovered, in fact, all this notion of painting as craftsmanship and sort of separating themselves from some of the crazier stuff that these more postmodern or conceptual artists have specialized in. Not that that's bad, but just a different tack. Right? And this is another artist from that group, Blue Gold. This wonderful series of hers of these women that are in the water, and we don't know if they plunged in to commit suicide, or they fell in, or they're just swimming and having a wonderful time and lost in the, you know, the resonances of the water. Unbearable. Envious of clouds and kites, of hawks loosed among the clouds and kites, water chose to do more than wallow in reflection, shift from blue to greener darkness, and shake the glinting ruse of lights broken like that habit of breath and the lead that land bestows upon our flesh. Water then thickened as it freed us from weights, precarious and persistent mesh. The woman hovers, gelled and free as a fish, and ventures resonance with no fear of death in this world. For the moment, twirling like dust in a beam of light or smoke that halos the hearth, she rises to the mirror's skin, a veil, consigned, like a flaw in a gem that crowns a life resigned. And the last poem brings us back to Cuba and everything else that we've been talking about. This is based on a sculpture by Guy Garcia on Icarus. And it's a fascinating sculpture because Guy inverts the Greek myth of the boy with the melting wings. Here the wings are solid, they're like beams of bronze, they are beams of bronze. What melts is the boy, what cracks is the figure, as if something inside of us made us incapable of being and living where we're supposed to be. Fall. The failure is in the body, cracking, wounded bronze edges blunting like cliffs that are hills now, soon plains. Then the seas cradle only to lift millennia later with the skin. Time has turned into opals. The wings are firm like pillars. So much for the myth of the boy who mumbled dreams of justice, whose father built the tyrant's web, fleeing above the mouths of volcanoes that looked like burned coins, and the turbulent sea turned into an innocent spectacle of foam when pondered from such heights. This time it is something inside that went wrong before the wings could taste the sun or the salt could nest in the boy's branches. What were the origins of betrayal, and what were its conditions? Did something snap in the genes of the boy, tyrant, long before the crowd stared rapt at his pyre of justice? Or in his people, now blank-eyed and undulant with fists, was it in each of them the crack, the wound that now drags the golden leader into the vault of a ghost heart? The boy will haunt the sea the way a reflection fills a mirror, leaving no testament. His ears will fail to quiet the hum of the hate he fled from, and a moment before drowning he will know himself an emblem of the general order to surrender. He will have no time to curse the sun that burns whatever it feeds. And I just want to thank the Nakai and Ellen Leader for inviting me here tonight, and the University of Miami's Institute of Cuban and Cuban American Studies in Casa Agardí, and the artists for enabling me to surround myself with so much haunting beauty, write poems about their work, and come up with these crazy ways of analyzing their work, And it's thrilling and beautiful, and don't forget those terms. Really. Try to buy a car with them. Be happy to entertain any questions if you have any.